Please join me in welcoming to Distinctive Voices, Dr. Francisco Ayala.
Thank you, Susan. It is always a pleasure to be here, and of course I see always a great number of friends in the audience, which adds to my level of confidence. So let me get to it right away in the following way. This is the universal tree of life. Here at this corner we have what is called the universal common ancestor, sometimes the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. And there are three large groups of organisms: the eukaryotes, which include us, all the animals, plants, and fungi, as well as many microscopic organisms. Some of them cause very notable diseases, like, say, malaria. Eukaryotes are distinguished because we have very complex cells with many organelles, and we have the DNA separated in the nucleus. The other two groups of organisms are microscopic, and you surely have heard of bacteria. Very often, people tend to think of bacteria as harmful creatures, but bacteria are essential for life. Without them, we could not live. And then there is this other group, archaea, which I would not be surprised if many of you have not heard of, because they were not known until 30 years ago. Now, this diagram is constructed with a convention that the length of each branch is approximately proportional to the variation in the number of species, to the diversity of the group represented there. So you can see that all the animals, fungi, and plants, the only creatures that were known to exist by humans up to, say, 300 years ago, we are actually a small fraction of the total tree of life. And these creatures that have been discovered very recently, microscopic organisms, just to cite a relatively recent study, somebody went to the Caribbean, got 50 gallons of water, and got tens of thousands of new species. So you can imagine the amount of diversity that exists everywhere, and yet we didn't know they existed up to 30 years ago. Animals are made of a number of major groups, and one of the major groups are the mammals. And among the mammals, we have here the rodents, the mice and the like, lagomorpha, which are the rabbits, and then primates, which are the monkeys and us. And if we look at the primates, you see their divergence is relatively recent. The last universal common ancestor in the first slide lived about 3.5 billion years ago. Now we are much closer to the present, just 50 million years ago. But if you look at our closest relatives, which are the chimpanzees, they are more closely related to us than either one humans or chimpanzees are to the gorillas or orangutan. But so the divergence there occurred within the last 6 or 7 million years. So we are not only one species and only one species out of the 2 million or so that have been described. It is estimated that probably there are more than 20 million species on Earth. That is without counting the archaea in the ocean. But so we are one out of many million, but also we are newcomers. To give you an idea of how recent we are, I will mention again that life is supposed to have originated on Earth about 3.5 billion years ago. Our species, Homo sapiens, came into existence 150,000 years ago. Now, it's very difficult to compare hundreds of thousands of years or thousands of years with millions and billions, but let me, to try to help you get the right scale, let me do the following transformation. Let us assume that the origin of life on Earth occurred on January 1st, at the very beginning of the year, and that today is December 31st, midnight. in that scale, our species, Homo sapiens, came about on December 31st at 11:45 in the evening. So we have been around very little time, so to speak, and that is important to know because I am going to right away shift gears and make the point that we are one among millions of species and a newcomer species, but we are very different kind of species, very, very special. So let me look at what happened after the divergence of the primates from the hominids. The lineage that goes to modern humans, to us, after the separation from the lineage that goes to the chimpanzee, these are called hominids. And large number of species are known, and here we are, coming about only 150,000 years ago. Several things happened that made us very different. And if we look anatomically at us and compare ourselves with chimpanzees, the two most obvious differences, among many others, are that we have a bipedal gait. As you will see in a moment, that's not how the chimpanzees or gorillas walk. And we have a very large brain, just about 4 times the size of the brain of a chimpanzee. Well, how do we know that our ancestors were bipedal? They became bipedal very early after the separation from the lineage that goes to the chimpanzees. And if we look at these ancestors of ours, the way to know that they are bipedal is by studying their anatomy. And a very important discovery was made about 35 years ago, almost to the date, of a creature known as Lucy. The technical name is Australopithecus afarensis. That was an important discovery for many reasons. 40% of the skeleton of a single individual had been found. At that time, it was very shocking, was very important. It actually stimulated government agencies and private foundations to invest more in the study of human evolution with many positive results, because most of the discoveries that are reflected here have been made after that time. So let us look at this, at Lucy. She lived about 3.5 million years ago. And here you have the skeleton that was discovered. If you look at the hip bone, you see it's very similar to that of modern humans. I have changed the scale here. I have enlarged it considerably because Lucy, as we will see, was a very small creature. But just to compare the shape, I have enlarged it here, and you see how similar it is to our shape as compared to the shape of the hip bone of a gorilla or a chimpanzee. And you can see with a hip bone like the one of Lucy, also all of the other ancestors, all the other hominid ancestors, she could not walk like that. This is how gorillas and chimpanzees walk. It is called knuckle walking. They walk on their foreheads, resting on the knuckles. So we know that our ancestors have been bipedal for a long time, for 6 or 7 million years ago, but the brain was small. It remained small until very recently, relatively speaking, started to grow about 2 million years ago. Here you have a reconstruction of Lucy compared with a modern human. It was a very little creature. We have about 4 times the brain size of a chimpanzee, our closest relatives. So 1.3 kilograms, roughly 3 pounds, even a little bit more. Why did we get such a big brain? Well, one of the reasons why is because we became bigger. You see, if you compare Lucy with us, we have gone from being a little more than 3 feet to being nearly 6 feet. And in anatomy, there is a correlation between the size of the various parts of the body, what is called allometric growth. So a big whale has a bigger brain than we do, and an elephant has a bigger brain than we do. but that's because we have such a bigger body. So one has to take this into account. The question then for us is, do we have a bigger brain, you see, 1400 cc compared to about 400, because we became bigger or something else? And the answer is something else. And here you have a way, I think a dramatic way, in which I like to show this sometimes to my students. You have here increase in body size, here the increase in brain size, and the allometric relationship, this expected anatomic relationship for primates, is indicated by this line. You see, as you go from 40 kilograms of a chimpanzee to more than 100 kilograms in a male gorilla, the brain increases a little bit. And so, with respect to the orangutan, and also with respect to these ancestors of ours, which are called Australopithecus. Yet, about 2 million years ago, Homo habilis has a much bigger brain, and then we do, considerably bigger brain. So suddenly, a small increase in body size, relatively speaking small, has resulted in a very large increase in brain size. Why? Well, here is a model, and by no means this is something that we can say we know this is the way it happens, but it's one of the ways in which we can make sense of what happened in human evolution. Once the bipedal position occurred, the bipedal gait evolved, we had a situation where our ancestors had two limbs that now they didn't need to use for walking, but they could use to handle objects, to grasp and the like. And what happened is, and this part we know, is that the hand evolved in a way that is remarkable. If you think about how resourceful an instrument our hand is, we can handle very tiny objects, we can handle relatively large objects, we feel temperature, the quality of the surface of objects and the like. Our closer relatives don't have that is the chimpanzee and the gorilla. We also have a fully opposing thumb that allows us to handle things. So somehow we know the evolution of the hand took place, and at some point, we assume about 2 million years ago, because it's when we find the first rests showing this, that they started to make tools. And making tools proved to be a tremendous advantage to our ancestors, because they will make tools for hunting or for whatever, or for even fighting. Individuals who were able to make better tools were more successful at surviving and reproducing. Therefore, they left more progeny, and this progeny will be smarter than others. And again, among the new generations, again and again, those individuals who were smarter make better tools, were more successful, and then this is what I'm representing here with this feedback loop. Tool making was made possible by the bipedal gait, and once that process started, we have a feedback loop, which we do know that it happened because starting with Homo habilis about 2 million years ago, the brain, as you saw in that representation a moment ago, started to increase, seems almost continuously, gradually, and very fast. Well, let me now point out two other features that distinguish us from other animals: the bipedal gait, opposing thumbs, and the hand changes, large brain. We have a number of others which each one of them would deserve a full lecture, but I will move on to behavioral differences, most notably intelligence associated with our large brain. Then we have language, we have self-awareness and death awareness, tool-making and technology, science, literature and art, ethics and religion, and so on. These are distinctive features of our species that are not present in any other animal species. And of course, now I'm going to focus on ethics and the origin of morality. Philosophers distinguish three kinds of issues in ethics, what they call meta-ethics, that is why we ought to do what we ought to do; normative ethics, which is what we ought to do, and practical ethics, which deals with particular issues. Now, with respect to metaethical doctrine, that is justification of morality, why there is morality, why we ought to do what we ought to do, there are a number of schools and of theories, many more than shown here, but these are some of the main ones. One is what is called moral realism. That is, these are people who claim that there are moral facts, that killing is a bad thing, killing another individual or committing adultery is a bad thing. It's not that society declares that these things are evil, it's that they are bad things in themselves. So it's possible to distinguish between good and bad things by looking at the world. There are, of course, many people that would follow the rules of morality mostly for religious reasons. And this is the theories that philosophers call of divine command. Is God's commanding what makes something morally good or morally bad? And then some other theories, utilitarianism, which was in the second half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, very popular among philosophers and others, says the reason why we should distinguish, or the way to distinguish between what is morally good and what is morally bad, is in terms of the consequences. Those things are good that do benefit the most people. Those things are bad that harm the most people or fail to benefit others. And finally, there is this other, again, from about the same time, starting in the second half of the 19th century, but it's called positivism, which they say there are no rational foundations for morality, so all what there is about morality are social rules, agreement, for example, among governments or tribes or societies which decide what is going to be good and what is going to be evil. Traditionally, in the history of modern religions, or particularly in the monotheistic religions, the view of morality is a compound of several of these things, and I'm going to use as an example St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest perhaps of the Christian theologians in the 13th century, who sees that there are three kinds of moral law. One is the divine command, this religious divine revelation. God tells us, do some things or don't do some other things, like worship the only one God or love your neighbor. But there is also natural law. This relates to the people who believe there's objective morality in the real world. Thomas Aquinas agrees completely with that. He says that we shouldn't kill, that is, other human beings, or that we shouldn't commit adultery is based on objective reality. And finally, there is what in the previous slide was called positivism, civil authority, that governments, whether large scale in a nation like ours or in a small tribe or whatever, establish rules like respect private property or pay taxes and the like. This is the way in which I think most religions, at least the monotheistic religions, saw religion as having these three compounds, or three components, or a variation of them. Now, in 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species, and there he produced convincing evidence that humans had come about by evolution, that we are not created out of nothing, but rather through a long period, thousands, millions of years and millions of generations, we eventually have come about. And there was immediately an effort by philosophers and scientists to now base morality on evolution, on the fact of evolution. So we came about, and as we came about, there was morality. So morality must have evolved with us. Most notable among the contemporaries of Darwin was Herbert Spencer, a younger contemporary of Darwin, which gave Darwinism a bad name, invented what came to be called social Darwinism. He argued as follows: evolution has happened because of the struggle for existence. Those who are stronger, who are more successful, they're the ones who pass their genes to the next generation. So this is the rule of life. So he said that should be the rule of morality as well. And of course, there's from many points of view, a very destructive approach to morality, because essentially is what was adopted actually at about a century ago or so by some of the great capitalists in the United States, the so-called robber barons and others who thought they were justified to do whatever they could to get themselves richer, because that's what natural law is all about, struggle for existence. The role of the governments, according to Herbert Spencer, should be exclusively to protect people from interfering with other people. But every one of them should try to get ahead. Well, from the moral point of view, or philosophical point of view, if you wish, there is an obvious critique of that. And Thomas Huxley, which was almost an exact contemporary of Herbert Spencer, younger, like Herbert Spencer was a little younger than Darwin, but contemporaries, he says there's naturalistic fallacy. The fact that something is that way does not mean that it ought to be that way. The fact that something happens does not mean that that is right. And this has been identified by a great philosopher, the great Scottish philosopher David Hume, and it has been named the naturalistic fallacy by again philosopher at the beginning of the 20th century, which is identifying what is with what ought to be. And modern philosophers and theologians will agree that that is a fallacy. Well, two other scientists now in the middle of the 20th century who tried to justify morality on evolution are Julian Huxley, a grandson of the Thomas Huxley that we saw before, and Waddington, both of them British. And they said, well, Herbert Spencer was wrong, because not everything that happens in the struggle for existence, because it happened, has to be considered good. But anything that happened in the evolution of humans, then we would all agree that that is good, because we are the prevailing line, as it were, of evolution, and the most progressive. Well, these arguments, I am not going to develop or criticize them at any length. They fall in the same fallacy that was pointed out by Thomas Huxley, the grandfather of Huxley, of Julian Huxley, as well as the other philosophers. Let me look now to what Darwin himself says. Darwin explored morality in his book, The Descent of Man, which was published in 1871, 12 years after The Origin of Species. It's his second most important book, without any question. And he was not always consistent. That needs to be said, to be fair, and tried to develop a system of morality, and there are contradictions here and there. But if one focuses in the prevailing way of thought, I think he has two major conclusions that I am excerpting here in two quotations. One is this: an animal with well-defined social instincts, like parental and filial affections, would inevitably acquire a moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well or nearly as well developed as in man. So he's saying any organism that would have the kind of intelligence that we have would be a moral creature. Couldn't help being a moral creature. But then he says something else. I do not wish to maintain that any strictly social animal, if its intellectual faculties were to become as active and as highly developed as in man, would acquire the same moral sense as ours. They might have a sense of right and wrong, though led by it to follow widely different lines of conduct. So any organism would have the kind of intelligence we have will be a moral being, but would not necessarily have the same rules of morality. since you are all looking very serious and you need obviously a moment of relief, I should tell you that this text of Darwin are not written with a Spanish accent. I just add the Spanish accent for color. Well, so this introduces my own elaboration of the subject, which is based in that distinction between the capacity for ethics. Darwin says if somebody will reach the kind of intelligence we have, will be a moral being, that is, will not be able to avoid evaluating actions as good or evil. He will be a moral creature. And the other thing that Darwin says, however, the codes of ethics, the norms by which we judge a particular action, are a different matter. He says they would have ethics, but not necessarily the same ethics as we do. And these are the 2 points that I'm going to elaborate now in the rest of the lecture. To facilitate understanding of what I mean by this distinction, I'm making a comparison with language. What I think is obvious, the capacity for language is different from the particular languages that we speak. So the distinction that I'm making is the capacity for ethics, evaluating actions as good or evil, is very different from the codes of ethics, the norms by which we judge a particular action. The two are related. They are completely different matters as they are for language. So now let me take up the capacity for ethics. I would argue that we are necessarily ethical beings. That is, we cannot fail to evaluate our actions as being either good or evil. Not all our actions, but all the actions that are relevant, that have the impact other individuals in society. So and I believe that the reason why the capacity for ethics is a necessary attribute of humans is because we have these three abilities which jointly define, I think, what is necessary for there being ethical behavior. First, we have the ability to anticipate the consequences of one's actions. Well, first, let me define morality, as it has been implicit all along, in terms of the consequences of our actions with respect to other human beings. That's perhaps the most important, I think, consideration in there being morality. If I pull a trigger, the trigger of my gun, pulling the trigger is not a moral action. That becomes only a moral action if I know that by pulling the trigger, I'm going to shoot my enemy. I'm going to shoot a bullet, which is going to kill my enemy. Then the pulling the trigger becomes a moral action, only in terms of the consequences of the actions, not the action itself. Where do we get our ability to anticipate the consequences of our actions? From this feedback loop. It was when our ancestors started to make tools that they could anticipate the use of the tools. Anticipating the future requires high intelligence. It may not seem to you all that obvious until you think about it, but it requires forming mental images of realities that are not present. I'm making a knife because I'm going to use for cutting. I'm making an arrow because I'm going to use it for hunting. So I have to have a mental image of something that is not present. Only humans have, I would claim, this capacity. And it is related to the beginning of tool making, which is precisely what led to our enlarged brain and our exalted intelligence. We need the ability to make value judgments. That is, again, pulling the trigger is not a moral action unless I know that, or I make the judgment that killing my enemy is better than not killing him, or vice versa. That is, we have to see actions as members of general classes, like killing, stealing, and doing other kinds of things. Now, we make value judgments with respect to many aspects of our behavior, not only morality, but we have aesthetic values, to find something more beautiful than others, economic values, gastronomic values. We prefer some foods to others. All sorts of values. Moral values are only one category of them, but we need to have moral values. And that requires that we see particular actions or behaviors as members of general categories. That is, it requires the capacity for abstraction. So seeing a pear as a member of a category which is pears, and an apple as a category which is apples, and I prefer this pear to this apple because this is a pear and this is an apple, because I remember those two categories. And that again comes from our great intelligence or exalted intelligence. Animals are not able, I think it's fair to say it, although we'll not be able to prove it here or to attempt to prove it, that animals are not able to see objects are members of general categories. They don't have the capacity for abstraction than we do. And finally, we need free will. The three attributes for there being a moral action is that we must have the capacity of not to behave that way. In other words, pulling the trigger is not a moral action if I would not have the option not to pull the trigger. Okay? The beating of the heart is not a moral action. I cannot go to my wife at the end of the day and say, I have behaved so well the whole day. I have kept my heart beating. Unless actions are under the control of free will, they obviously cannot have moral implications. Now, free will is philosophically a very difficult thing to demonstrate, to discuss, to prove, whatever you want to call it, and I'm not going to attempt it here, except that we all have the experience that we have free will. When we pull the trigger, we are able not to pull it. And also we have, when confronted with alternatives of action, say two alternatives of action, we can mentally start to explore many more alternatives, which means that we are enlarging the field within which we can exercise our free will. So our common experience tells us that we have free will, and I will take it as that. But again, in all three cases, what we have are the expression of highly developed intelligence, which is distinctive of humans and only of humans among living organisms. So the capacity for ethics is a result of evolution. It's because we became very smart that we have these three abilities, and we cannot help but evaluating actions, some actions, as having moral consequences. What about the codes of ethics, the norms by which we judge a particular action? I'm going to suggest to you that the codes of ethics are not the result of biological evolution, but of cultural evolution, which follows completely different rules. So it's not biologically determined. The codes of ethics are not biologically determined. If you recall what Darwin was saying in the two quotations that I have to admit selected quotations, but where he says, any animal that would reach our intellectual capacity will be a moral being, but they would not necessarily have the same codes of ethics. That's consistent with the idea that I am advancing here. The codes of ethics are the result of culture. Let me again remind you of the distinction between capacity for ethics and codes of ethics, like the capacity for language and the particular language that one speaks. One can have capacity for language, but they speak very different languages. One can have the capacity for ethics and have very different codes of ethics, and that is indeed what happens in the world and what has happened through time, and happens at multiple levels. So the codes of ethics, the norms by which we judge a particular action, I am arguing are the result of cultural evolution, the human experience once we were humans. First, that there is cultural evolution as there is biological evolution, I think cannot be doubted. For there being evolution, we need three things: heredity, variation, and differential reproduction. This natural selection. This differential reproduction refers to different variants, different variations, different eye color, or different blood groups, or whatever, being transmitted with less or more efficiency than others. So we have to have heredity, transmission, you have to have variation, and differential reproduction. And that we do have at the cultural level. And I'm defining culture in a very broad sense, which will become a little more clear in a moment, including everything that we do as distinctively human, from our technology, our literature, our religion, our social institutions, everything else. All of those are subject to cultural evolution. But looking at ethics, there is variation. Remember, one of the conditions for there being evolution, certainly we know from common experience the different individuals have different norms of ethics. Just before I started the lecture, we were having a conversation with some of my neighbors, and there are some people who have very different views as to whether we should or should not use animals in research. And if we use them in we use animals for research, how we should treat them. And of course, almost all of us will be inclined to treat animals with respect and try not to do harm and try not to kill them. But there are people who go to the extreme and say you shouldn't do it, even if it may benefit humans greatly. There are others who say, yeah, we could do it under proper conditions. So there is variation among individuals, and of course there is variation among groups. I suppose you react with as much horror as I do when I read in the news that some young woman is being killed because she was raped. She was married, she was raped, and a raped woman brings disgrace to her family, and therefore has to be killed. And that is considered morally right, apparently, in some societies, and so many other things that one does not need to elaborate. There is considerable variation among human groups as to what is morally right and what is morally wrong. And there is variation through time. You think about it, I mean, many people here are, if not my age, not very young anymore, and you probably are aware, as I am, that when I was growing up, the environment, we had responsibilities about the environment, that was not even crossing our minds. In fact, at that time, I'm talking about at least half a century ago or more, there were many people that thought we should exploit the environment to the benefit of mankind. That's why we have the environment. And there was also the biblical mandate going back 2.5 millennia, that you should produce as many children as possible. You should fill the earth, replenish the earth. Now many of us would think that we have a moral obligation to have a limited number of children. Well, this is rather obvious. I'm just elaborating the fact that there is this variation through time and among groups. So we have also selection, that is the transmission of these ideas, of these moral convictions vary. Some are more efficient than others. Some have been more successful. And I have some examples here. Monotheism. Monotheism was started, according to current religious scholars, monotheism in the modern sense, of one God over the whole of humankind, probably at the time of the Babylonian captivity, 2,600 years ago. And yet, those few people who were there, probably no more than a few tens of thousands at the most, those Israelites now have among their descendants 3 billion people who are monotheists. There's the result of, cultural selection. It's not because we are all descendants of that small group of people. It's because the idea was very successful and has been transmitted to such a large part of mankind. And I have another example related to that one, again, because these are familiar examples. Moses and the Ten Commandments. You have a group of Israelites leaving Egypt and trying to get to the Promised Land. Probably were not more than a few hundred people living for 40 years in the misery of the Sinai desert. And of course they needed very strict rules to behave there. So Moses goes to Mount Sinai and gets the revelation of the Ten Commandments. And of course they were very successful. They survived those 40 years, and then they conquer Israel. The Ten Commandments now have, as moral norms, are very generally accepted in modern mankind, if not universally so. So we have cultural selection with ideas that have been very successful, and of course these ideas have been very successful, have been favorably selected, very often with enforcement from civil authority, because Moses told the Israelites, well, you should not commit adultery, you shouldn't steal the cow of your neighbor, and if you do, we're going to kill you. So, and of course, you should not think you can get away with it, because God is watching. So there are these reinforcements, but the fact is the norms of morality in different human groups have been transmitted with different effectiveness. Some have spread, some have disappeared. We know, and cultural anthropologists know, of many sort of systems of morality, primitive systems of morality of many tribes and groups throughout the history of mankind that have just virtually disappeared. A few have been greatly successful. Let me just finish by making a couple of points. One of them is that cultural evolution, the transmission of ideas, as opposed to the transmission of genes, is much more efficient. Cultural evolution is more effective than biological evolution because, among other reasons, it's more rapid. You know, an idea which is successful, instrument, you know, there were no personal computers when I was a student in college. There were no cell phones. There was no internet just a few years ago, a quarter of a century ago. And yet we have these creations of the human mind, these inventions which have spread through all of mankind. Biological transmission requires thousands of generations for a mutation, a change, to spread to a great number of individuals, not to speak of all of mankind. With ideas, including moral ideas, the transmission can happen in one generation. Moreover, the mutations, that is, the changes, are directed. Biological mutations happen whenever they happen. The cultural mutations are inventions, are discoveries, and can occur at high frequency, and moreover, they are precisely those changes that we want, that are effective. Because many mutations, many inventions and discoveries, they become discarded, but a few are very successful. Also, they are cumulative. In biological evolution, you have a gene, it can change by mutation, and then can change again. But if the first change was beneficial, then the next one is not necessarily cumulative with it. In cultural evolution, changes are cumulative. And finally, group selection. In biological evolution, for reasons that I will not go into here, having something that benefits the group doesn't work. There's the genes, the mutations that help are those that benefit the individual, not the group. In cultural evolution, the things that benefit the group work because we are aware that we are having some behavior or some discovery or whatever, and that we all benefit from it, and therefore we protect it, and then our group does better than another group, our economy better, some other economy, or our system of morality more successful than some other system of morality. So I think that in the way in which the norms of morality evolve is through these rules of cultural evolution. So they are largely creations of the mind, have the spread, some more successful than others. Now, these creations of the mind, these inventions, these moral norms, have to be consistent with our biology. They are not determined by our biology, but have to be consistent. Imagine a norm of morality which would say the supreme norm of morality is to be celibate. Well, the society that adopted the norm of morality is not around, for obvious reasons. Well, this is an extreme case, but they have to be consistent with the needs of our biology. But the point I'm making is that it is not, the norms of morality are not the result of biological evolution, but the creations of human cultures, and therefore subject to evolution by the rules of cultural evolution, fast and directed. So these are the conclusions that have been stated now for the last little while, is that the capacity for ethics is the result of biological evolution. It's because we became so smart, to put it bluntly, through the beginning of using tools and how effective making tools was for our ancestors, and our brain enlarged, and we became very smart, and that's why we are ethical beings. But the codes of ethics are the subject of cultural evolution, and therefore subject to much faster change and much faster and effective manipulation. Thank you very much.